bringing you the latest in tax credit news, insight, and analysis. This is Tax Credit Tuesday with your host, Michael Novogradac.
Hello, I'm Michael Novogradac, and this is Tax Credit Tuesday. This is the January 13th, 2026 episode. Now, those of you watching on YouTube can see my guests this week are Brad Elphick and Rebecca Darling, partners in Novogradac's Atlanta office. You probably, if you've watched a few of these podcasts, particularly ones that talk about new markets tax credits, you probably understand now what it is we're going to talk about. And of course, they're here to join me to discuss the recent new markets tax credit awards announcement. The awards announcement gratefully came 2 days before Christmas, where a record-breaking $10 billion in allocation issuance authority was awarded. This record-breaking amount of aggregate issuance authority led to a record-breaking number of awardees, led to the highest average award amount, as well as the most rural awards. The announcement also contains some language that gives some clues as to how future rounds may change and how many CDEs may deploy their current awards. Now, before we get started, we'll get started quickly. I just wanted to let everyone know in our audience that Brad, Rebecca, and I, along with a number of other Novogradac professionals, will be in San Diego next week. We'll be there next Thursday and Friday, of course, at our Novogradac New Markets Tax Credit Conference. Currently, we have over 500 people registered, and I expect it to keep climbing. Now, we're going to go further in depth on everything we're talking about today, but I also want to note that the New Market Tax Credit Working Group will also be meeting in advance in San Diego the Wednesday before. If you want to learn more about the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, I invite you to reach out to Rebecca or Brad, or just send an email to cpas@novoco.com. And of course, it's not too late to register for the conference. I will include a link in the show notes. As you probably are surmising, we have a lot we want to talk about today. So if you're ready, let's get started. So Brad and Rebecca, this is always one of my exciting episodes when we get to talk about the awards. But before we jump into the awards, it is the 5th straight year that I've had both of you on. And Brad, you also served as a host. So this is your 22nd visit. And Rebecca, this is your 10th visit. So you made it to the 10th. So welcome back. Please take a moment to talk a little bit about the services you provide to Novogradac clients before we jump into the details of the awards. And I'll start with you, Rebecca.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So I've been with Novogradac for just over 20 years now, and I primarily focus on community development and affordable housing. So my clients include community development entities, or CDEs, or allocatees, which we'll be talking about today, developers, businesses, and investors. I help clients with audits and tax returns, AMIS reporting, compliance needs, and I also read and advise on allocation applications.
Excellent. Brad?
Well, I would like to just say ditto to most of that. Rebecca and I have worked together for a long time in the Atlanta office. And so in addition to what Rebecca mentioned, I also work new markets, LIHTC, historic, a little bit of everything. But I also have the joy of being able to lead the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. It's very exciting. It's because last year was a very eventful year for the working group, and it was very busy. And so that was a lot of fun, and being able to work with some great clients with that. So those are, in addition to what Rebecca said, serving clients on the audit and tax side, applications, and so forth. That's the other thing that I do as well.
Great. Thank you for that. Now let's jump in to the awards and all of us sort of being accountants. I want to start with the quantitative aspects of it. Then we'll get into the qualitative. But starting with the quantitative, I mentioned a record-breaking number of awardees, record-breaking average award per allocatee, as well as record number of rural awards. But I didn't say what the numbers were. So I'll turn to you, Rebecca, to share some of the actual sort of statistics and other takeaways from the awards, but I also want you to share what your prediction was. Now, Brad and I have had lots of these episodes where we've thrown out numbers. I do not actually recall what my prediction was. If I would have guessed, I would have said somewhere between something less than 150, because that would have been double. That would have been 50% more than in the past. Anyway, but I don't actually recall. So maybe one of the listeners, if they remember from one of the prior episodes, what Brad or maybe Brad remembers what he predicted. But with that, take it away, Rebecca.
Thanks. I actually had to go back to my old podcast notes to say, okay, what did I guess? Because that was a long time ago now. And I was pretty close on a lot of them. So I'm going to take the wins where I can get them. I was only 3 months off in guessing when we would get award announcements. So, but I'm going to say there were some outside factors out there that we had there. So, as you mentioned, we had a record number of awardees. So we had 142 awardees, which is fantastic. That means we had, out of the 216 applicants, there's about a 65% success rate, which is fantastic and much higher than we normally see with just a $5 billion round. I had guessed 140 awardees, so I'm going to count those two difference as immaterial, and I'm going to take the win. I guessed an average award size of 60 million, and we actually saw 70 million, which I thought was notable. There were a lot of large awards, and that average certainly went up significantly. Speaking of largest awards, largest award was 95 million. I had guessed 90 million. So again, we saw a lot of really large awards, which wasn't too surprising given that applicants knew that we were looking at a double round, that the maximum that you could request as a CDE went from 100 million to 120 million. So it wasn't a huge increase. So a lot of CDEs went ahead and planned on increasing what they would normally have asked for, and certainly received quite a bit. The number of first-time awardees was much higher than we've seen in recent rounds. We saw 7 first-time awardees, which was actually what I guessed. So I was pretty excited about that. So I got that one on there. And we also saw 24 rural CDEs. And even interim CDFI Fund directors, Alex Smith, specifically mentioned this during the CDFI Fund's advisory board meeting on December 29th. She specifically highlighted that 68 allocatees committed to deploying $2.4 billion in rural areas, and further went on to highlight that the commitment to rural areas is in alignment with the administration's priorities. So again, I think we'll have a lot of conversations about CDEs deploying to rural areas. I also thought something that was really interesting was in the award book that the CDFI Fund publishes, they noted that 137 of the 142 allocatees committed to invest at least 20% of their QLICs in deep distress areas. So if you remember, this was a new question in the application in the last round. And the CDFI Fund indicated that an applicant that commits to a higher percentage commitment, and the highest percentage was 20% or more, would generally score more favorably. And so I think that certainly highlights, looking at the number of allocatees that made that type of commitment, that gave us a lot of information into how important that scoring of that particular question was. And then I also wanted to highlight there were only 9 allocatees that committed to investing in NMTC native areas, which was a bit lower than I expected. But I anticipate that given that it's part of the 4 area category of deep distress, I would expect more and more CDEs maybe building out their track record to be able to deploy to native areas going forward.
Great. Thank you for that. We'll talk about it a bit more. When you made reference to the new question about deeper distress, to me, that was also reflective of the fact that every administration that comes in puts their own imprint of various government programs, including the New Market Tax Credit Awards. So it's later in the podcast, I want to talk about how the current administration is influencing the direction of awards sort of going forward. But for that, let's continue on the results side. Brad, what do you want to layer in that Rebecca didn't note with respect to the awards announcement and the outcomes, and anything that surprised you or didn't surprise you?
Well, I did not go back to previous show notes, so I'm going to assume that my predictions before were spot on as well. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, well, first of all, 10 billion is a lot more fun than 5 billion. Let's just admit that we really enjoyed $10 billion. So let's do it again. So let's get legislation passed to increase the amount of new market tax credit allocation. Cause I think we all had, much better experience. As Rebecca said, over 65% success rate is a lot better. And I think one of the takeaways I had was related to the size of the awards, as Rebecca mentioned. This round, the average award size was 70 million. And in the previous 5 rounds before that, the largest award size was 65 million, I believe. And so you had a much larger award size pool where more than 2/3 or 67% of the awards were greater than the largest award size in the previous 5 rounds. So that's really indicative of the size of the awards being much larger this round than they had been in previous round. And I think we'll kind of talk about what that might mean later as well. But I think when you have that much allocation going to single CDs, it just really gives them a lot more flexibility of how they can use that award amount. And then we also noticed that the scores of the applications became even more condensed. And we keep talking about that, I think, every year over the last 5 years that we've done this, about how the application scores are condensing, and that out of the 110 possible points that you can get, that we started to see more and more applications ending up in the top 2 scoring buckets. And that was true for this round as well. If you look at the top 2 buckets where the scores were somewhere between 106 and 110, so a 4-point spread, right, in the total score, 65% of the applicants were in those first 2 buckets, which is much greater than in previous years. In the prior round, it was only 54%. So we're starting to see every year as applicants are getting more comfortable with the application and more sophisticated, they're scoring higher. And if you've heard me before, and I've talked about this on new market tax credit working group calls, I'm pretty sure I've talked about it on a podcast, but I think there are some ways that the CDFI Fund probably could make some changes to the scoring process to maybe allow for a greater variety of scoring, and to maybe alleviate some of that condensing that we're seeing in the overall scoring at the top, so that maybe there's some greater differentiation between applications. But that was much higher than I expected to see. And then, as Rebecca said, she had thought that there would be less than double-digit number of first-time winners. I do remember recalling that I predicted that there would be double digits for the first time in a while, and unfortunately that didn't happen. But it, goes in along with the fact that scores are condensing, that it's much harder for a first-time winner, someone who hasn't won yet, to really crack into new market tax credits. And so we still saw that to be the case with this double round, which I was a little surprised by, since we had $10 billion, but really just goes to the fact of how difficult it is to win new market tax credit allocation.
So with the higher average amount per CDE, as well as more CDEs out there with allocation, how do you think that's going to affect their deployment of those awards? There's twice as much sort of allocation available. When I think about some of the parameters, I think about multiple CDE transactions versus single CDE transactions. And I also think about average loan size, absent talking about small businesses. How do you, it would seem like you'd have fewer multiple CDE transactions and higher average loan size or equity investment per qualified business. What's your take?
I 100% agree. You have more allocation out there. As I mentioned, you have more CDEs with larger allocation award sizes. And so with that, I think we've seen this trend more and more each year anyway, where CDEs are willing to allocate more allocation of their allocation to a single transaction. And I think that this gives them a little bit more flexibility and comfort in doing that, because I think part of the reason why CDs may try to allocate, do 5 deals instead of 2 deals is because they want some variety in their track record of the types of deals that they want to highlight that they use their new market tax credit allocation for. They have, certain projects that they like, and they want to ensure that those projects can get, enough funding. And so, but I think now that they have allocation, they may not be waiting to have other CDs come in with additional allocation to get that project enough new market tax credit allocation. And so they can allocate a full, if a project's looking for 20 million, maybe in prior rounds where you only had average award size of 45 million, CD may not have been willing to put 20 million into one deal. Now that they have a $70 million award or a $95 million award, they'll be more willing to put that full 20 million into a transaction. And so, as you mentioned, I think that will lead to more single CDE transactions. I think that that's a benefit for the quality B borrowers as well, because with less parties in the deal, you're likely to have lower transaction costs per new market tax credit dollar. So I think that's an overall benefit to the program, which again goes back to why I think we should have more allocation for new market tax credits. 10 billion is a lot more fun than 5 billion. But for the borrower in the communities, I think that really shows kind of one of the indirect benefits of this greater allocation pool, is that you can see a lower transaction cost per deal if you have a single CDE versus 2 or 3 CDs.
I totally agree with all of those observations. And I'm sure there's a few members of our audience that are looking at this going, well, it's great that you have double the awards. Having double the awards means you have double the amount of tax credits to be syndicated to investors. And if you increase supply, Economics 101 says, on average, your price is going to decline depending upon elasticity of demand. So at the various conferences that I've been at, the perpetual question is, what's the impact on the equity markets? Obviously, that's something we'll talk about next week down in San Diego. Have a much more expansive discussion we're going to be able to have here. But with that said, Rebecca, what are you hearing from investors? Share your thoughts.
Sure. I've heard a lot of talk because we knew the $100 billion round was coming. So there was a lot of time to plan and prepare. And I've heard a lot of discussions among applicants and awardees saying, I'm generally planning on taking longer to deploy because I'm expecting to have more allocation. So they're already giving themselves some room, but then investors have also been having similar conversations. They're expecting the $10 billion won't be deployed quite as quickly as $5 billion. We also saw $5 billion of QEIs closed in 2025. So I think the appetite is there. I think with time, we will see credit pricing continuing to maintain at a strong level. But I've also heard a lot more discussion about syndication of the new markets tax credit, where we haven't seen that as much in new market tax credit land as we have in some other tax credit areas. And then I've also heard about a lot of new players, new investors, new lenders, regional banks coming in and saying, with permanency and a $10 billion round, a lot are saying now's the time to really put forth the time and effort to understand what are new markets and participate in the program, where perhaps in the past they might not have been willing to put in that time. I think that's one of the things that we were saying for a long time that we would gain with permanency, and we're already seeing it. And I think that also leads into if you're new to new markets, that's one of the great things about our conferences is you get to meet so many different people, and there are always new organizations, new faces, and everyone is coming in to learn, because the benefit of new markets is how flexible it is. But that's also the curse of new markets, because we always are coming up with new questions and needing to come up with new solutions. And so we're always having new discussions. And so I think that a lot of folks are thinking about joining new markets or are building out a strategy and track record to be able to apply going forward. So I really see, especially the investor pool continuing to expand, where we've seen some stagnant growth there.
And I would add too, $10 billion, what wasn't a secret, right? It didn't just happen and we didn't know it was coming, right?
Yes.
We've been talking about 10 billion for over a year now, back when we were promoting the idea of combining the two rounds.
Yep.
And ever since then, we've been having this question. And so I think that the marketplace has taken that year plus to absorb the fact that there's going to be $10 billion awarded at some point, which happened 2 days before Christmas. And so they have been able to adjust their business plans, right, as investors, for how they're going to handle this $10 billion that is hitting the streets. And so I think that we've already seen the investor market start to adjust for that, and has been. And so if this had happened, and it truly was a surprise, I think we'd have bigger kind of discussions about pricing and fluctuations. But I think that, as on the many different investor panels I've moderated at our conferences, I think the appetite is very strong for new market tax credits. They've been able to build in the fact that there's going to be more of it available for them to invest in and use as part of their full tax incentive strategy. So I think that we've seen pricing stay fairly stable. It's dipped a little bit. There's no surprise there. But I think that overall it's not having the impact it would if you just all of a sudden doubled the market, doubled, how much allocation is available.
And maybe staying with the supply and demand observation I was making earlier, when you think about the $10 billion in awards, that's $3.9 billion in tax credits. So it's, as opposed to being slightly less than $2 billion in the typical $5 billion round, it's double that. So it goes to 3.9. When you look at the supply of tax credits more generally, long-term tax credits, we expect the supply in 2026 to be north of 30 billion. And renewables 40 to 50 billion. So when you're looking at 3.9, the slightly less than 2 billion doubling to 3.9 in terms of the supply, it's not that much of an increase in supply.
Right.
More about how, but it's not a substitute or a complementary good. It's an additional good with its attractiveness, depending on the investor bearing. It also, though, I think it also begs the question about what we as a broader community can be doing just to generally increase the demand for investment in market tax credits and just general business credits, development tax credits more generally. And maybe I'll have to have you back on a podcast to actually talk about some of the legislative regulatory proposals Congress could adopt and/or the administration in order to increase the demand for some of these various credits, and I should also say, and/or various regulatory agencies like the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Federal Reserve and the like, and even the Financial Accounting, the FASB, Financial Accounting Standards Board, and some of their rules around accounting for various types of investments, including market tax credits. But that's not what this podcast is. So now I want to kind of backpedal a bit here, because we've talked about the awards announcement. You've shared how you think it'll affect the deployment of the awards as well as the equity markets. But, Rebecca, you mentioned the awards did come out 3 months later than you predicted. And I think that was pretty universal. I don't think anybody was predicting it to be as late as it was.
Yeah.
Brad, what do you think some of the underlying reasons were that there was the delay?
Yeah, so I think there's many different reasons for the delay. So obviously you have a new administration come in 2025, and regardless of how quickly the CFI fund wanted to get through the award review process, it became very clear that with the new administration, there was going to be new focus on the CDFI fund, its activities, new oversight, and so forth. And with that new kind of oversight or questions about what is going on here, what is this program doing, and so forth, as you have new people in different roles, that overall is going to slow down any process, no matter how quickly the CFI fund staff wanted to get through what they did. And based on conversations I had with CFI fund staff, they actually got through the $10 billion awards, their process, much quicker than they had in prior years. But unfortunately, as comes with this oversight, just more people wanted to look at the awards, right? And so I think that greater involvement of people at different levels within Treasury, within OMB, within the White House, wherever that we're asking questions, that caused part of the delay. A government shutdown doesn't help either, especially when it's the largest.
There was that.
Yeah, just 43 days, no big deal. So obviously, the CDFI fund was shut down during that time as well. Even if there were emails inadvertently going out during the time, but it was shut down, and so they couldn't obviously make the award announcement during that time. It was our understanding that the awards would have been probably announced during that period that the government was shut down otherwise. So I think it came at, obviously at a bad time for purposes of when the awards would be announced.
And let me just also interject here where you're, I hate to interrupt you, but when you mentioned the 43 days, I always think it's important to note that it's 43 days, work isn't getting done. And then when it ends and folks come back, then they have to triage what to do. So, the question is where new market test awards announcement and that triaging. And there's no doubt there were a number of other things that were a lot that had to be done first. So it's really, so I always think about 43 days. It's not like it's just 43 days longer. It's 43 days longer plus all those additional days to catch up on the stuff that didn't get done that had a higher priority. So
and that's exactly what we've experienced with other shutdowns. Right. And I think the only thing about this shutdown didn't have as long of an impact in terms of picking it back up and finishing it was I think that in this round, the awards were fairly finished before the shutdown, right? So it would, that 43-day impact would probably had a much exponentially greater impact if it had been earlier in the year when they're still doing most of the kind of the application review process, right? So I think we were fortunate, I guess, in timing that in that regard. But when it reopened, it kind of gave another opportunity, as I mentioned before, for that additional oversight to kind of get their hands in it again and look at it and make sure that, I think that the concern was, is new market tax credit, are these awards going to align with the administration's priorities, right? And so they were taking additional look at those awards, is our understanding. And so, when the government reopened, I actually think it was, based on what we were hearing, we were originally thinking that it was going to be soon after the government reopened that they could make the award announcement, but it became very clear that that wasn't the case. And oh, by the way, during the government shutdown, there were also reduction in force notices that were issued. And so during that shutdown, there was a lot of concern about, if those would be rescinded. Fortunately, as part of the reopening of the government, those notices, which applied to all CDFI fund employees, which indicated they would no longer have jobs after a certain date. That was obviously a concern about, what impact that would have on the award announcement. And then you also, after the government reopened, but before the awards were announced, the program manager, the new market tax credit program manager, stepped down, resigned from his position at the CDFI fund. So that created a vacancy. You had the vacancy of the director of the CDFI fund, where you have the deputy assistant secretary, Alex Smith, now serving also as the acting director. So with those vacancies, that doesn't help obviously with the process. And so I think all of those different things contributed to the delay. And to be honest, I thought that we were going to go into 2026 before we saw the awards once we got past, Thanksgiving, and we're getting closer and closer to Christmas. So as we got, I was probably one of, just as surprised as anyone when they announced it on 2 days before Christmas. But I think at the end of the day that we were fortunate to get it in before year end. It definitely reduced a lot of the anxiety about the process and when it would actually finalize.
So the awards announcement included, a sentence that really emphasized, or a paragraph that put an emphasis on certain types of businesses. And there are 4 sort of bullet points that kind of get called out. And I want to get your take on how the call out of these 4 areas you think will affect the deployment of the current round of awards, as well as how it might be reflected in upcoming application rounds. And the 4 are affordable housing. This is obviously something you both know, but not all of our audience knows. Affordable housing. Number 2, small businesses. 3, domestic manufacturing and jobs. And 4, rural hospitals and community health infrastructure. So housing, small business, manufacturing and jobs, rural housing, and health care needs. So Rebecca, tell me what that means if I'm a CDE that just got an award, or I'm thinking of applying in the upcoming round, or I am a business seeking financing.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that we already knew a lot of what the administration's priorities were. There had been a lot of discussion about rural investments and jobs and manufacturing. And so I wasn't especially surprised to see this, but I think it was a very clear indication, first when thinking about CDEs and awardees, if you want to do more rural investments, you have this clear indication that this is going to be a priority, especially in the 2026 round. And so CDEs need to look at their track record when planning their pipeline. And so I can see a lot of CDEs looking at these categories and saying, is this something we're already doing? And if not, is that something that really falls within our business strategy? Are there changes we want to make to our business strategy to accommodate these areas or not? What I think is really interesting and wonderful about new markets is looking at all of these areas. We've already seen new markets serve all of these areas, which is part of the reason why the incentive has garnered such broad support over the years. And so when I look forward, the one item that I think will probably generate a lot of discussion this year would be the affordable housing. What does that look like? We've seen a lot of mixed use transactions where you've got some affordable housing units and other housing units available, as well as perhaps commercial businesses involved. But for sale housing, we haven't seen a lot of new markets transactions around that area. We certainly have seen some. What I do think is interesting is there are a lot of CDEs that have participated either as a parent organization or an affiliate organization in affordable housing, whether they're an investor or a lender or a developer. They've participated. And so I think that this is an area that if it's a priority of the CDFI Fund and the administration, can all put our heads down and probably find a lot of ways to increase the amount of affordable housing that is created as a result of new markets. So I think that I expect that CDEs will be very focused on deploying their allocation, looking at these areas to see what's already aligning with their investment strategy, what are potential changes that they're going to want to make, but also going ahead and starting to think about the next application and what makes sense and what doesn't. We are also hearing that there may be changes to the application to accommodate these areas or maybe prioritize them in the application. And so I think that will be another item that we'll discuss quite a bit over the next few months is what changes are we going to see to the application? I would love to see some streamlining of the application. Brad, you were talking earlier about just how condensed the scoring has been. It would be great to see, a handful of changes to the application just so that we could see more diversity in the scoring and more transparency. That would be fantastic.
I just want to emphasize some of your points there on the affordable housing side, just to level set with the audience. Residential rental, as defined in the tax code, is not an eligible business activity.
Yeah.
So for new markets, you can't do residential rental. And that's basically where over 80% of your rents are coming from residential rental units. That's why we do see housing along with in mixed use, where the commercial portion is more than 20%, which creates all sorts of underwriting issues and strategy you have to develop to make sure you don't violate that. Yes, that'd be more than 20% test and all the rest. And if you have questions about that, give Brad or Rebecca a call. But so there's the mixed use, on the affordable rental housing side. And then the for sale housing side, like you said, it's certainly not been a super high percentage use, but there are a number of groups that focus singularly on for sale housing. And our partner, Nicola Pinoli, and I did a podcast a few weeks ago on for sale housing and new market tax credits, not knowing that it was going to be called out in the awards announcement. And we do have a panel in San Diego specifically on for sale housing. So if anyone in our audience is interested in pursuing this for sale housing piece, please join us in San Diego. But with respect to small businesses, maybe we'll have one or both of you back or another Novogradac partner to talk about some of the ways in which new market tax credits can be used for small businesses and some of the challenges of smaller investment amounts and the rest, and how different CDEs are serving small businesses. And then to the extent either of you think it's relevant and or if our audience is interested, send an email to cpas@novogradac.com, and maybe we'll also do something on domestic manufacturing jobs as well as rural hospital and community health insurance or community health infrastructure, because those are obviously areas that you're going to see emphasis by the CDFI Fund with this administration, just like all administrations emphasize different aspects of the process.
And Mike, I think too, just to add, what's that mean for if you're one of these businesses, right? I think that really this gives you an idea of what types of projects all of these CDs are going to be looking for, not only with, as Rebecca said, the current allocation of $10 billion, but the next round where CDs will be applying for $5 billion, they're going to be looking for projects that fit one of these four categories, right? That have been highlighted here specifically. Now, CDs will go beyond these four categories, but you can imagine that most are looking at this as kind of a blueprint for a successful application, right? Is by targeting these priorities. And so if you're one of these projects, I would be putting together, my info sheet about my project and getting it out, because I think that CDs are going to want to show that they're already doing some of this activity and that they will do more in the next, in future rounds.
And I would just say, if I was one of those businesses, I would call you, Brad, or I'd call Rebecca.
That's right.
And say, can you help me put together that their sheet, if you will, that will help my request go to the top and demonstrate community benefits that I'm going to be providing. Because every one of these CDs want to create as many community benefits as possible. And if you're out there serving those communities, sometimes you're not as aware of which of those benefits are the most important to the CDE. So I definitely would encourage businesses to be reaching out to Rebecca Darling or Brad Elphick, join me here today, or another Novogradac partner that focuses on new markets tax credits to help you pull together that, that sometimes called brag sheet.
Right. Yeah. And we'll have a good idea of how the CDFI Fund intends to prioritize this over the next couple months as well. And then changes that they make to the application, which we'll talk about more on a future podcast, I'm sure, or even a webinar. So it'll be important to kind of pay attention to what that looks like, because we saw in this most recent round how much prioritizing certain things within the application can impact how CDEs apply. If you look at the deep distress commitment that was added in the last round, and Rebecca, you said the number, I think only, less than 10 applicants or awardees didn't have a 20% or more commitment to invest in those areas. That's powerful in terms of how, the CDFI fund can use the application to prioritize how CDEs use their new market tax credit allocation.
So Brad, usually right after the awards, there's a question that people have about when is the next round going to open? And usually it's not that far from when the awards announcement comes out. That's not the case this year. So please share what the traditional timeline would have been and why you think that timeline can't help but get pushed into the future.
Yeah. So in the last, handful of rounds, the following allocation round has opened about 45 to 60 days after the awards were announced. And with all things being equal, that's what we would have thought after this round. All things are not equal this year, and with this round, and there's several different aspects that are contributing to that delay. I think that if I were to kind of label or to list out a couple of those things that may impact, I think we've talked about some of them already. The CDFI Fund in its advisory board meeting before the end of the year mentioned that 2026 is a catch-up year for all of its different programs. And I think that will include new market tax credits. I think that the CDFI Fund wants to do a listening session or a road tour to find out more about ways that they can improve how new market tax credits are allocated, the application process, and so forth. I think within that, they're looking for ways that they can make these changes to the application. This award announcement that you mentioned, Mike, gives us a little bit of insight into the types of changes that they will want to make and the different things that they will want to prioritize. The CDFI Fund makes changes to every application each round. Only every 3 years do they actually put it out for public comment, unless the changes that they make are substantial enough to trigger a public comment period. Can't tell you what exactly that bright line is in terms of what triggers it and what doesn't. But if the CDFI Fund does intend to make some of these changes, it's not unlikely that those changes could be substantial enough to trigger a public comment period. If that's the case, that could be an additional 30 to 90 day comment period, which obviously would delay the opening of the next round. We talked about the vacancies already at the CDFI Fund. You have the vacancy of the new market tax credit program manager, and you have the deputy assistant secretary also serving as the acting director of the CDFI Fund. I'm sure she wants to not make that a permanent position and would rather have someone else be the director of the CDFI Fund. So I think that there will be obviously, some efforts made to fill those positions. However, there may be some issues internally with hiring freezes and so forth that may make that a longer process. But without having some of those parties in place, it obviously could slow down the process. I also mentioned the additional oversight that we're seeing from the administration and different parts within Treasury that we haven't traditionally seen. So I think that additional oversight and involvement from people higher up within Treasury, with people at OMB and other agencies and so forth, I think that can also have an impact. And then there's things that aren't really in their control, meaning the Treasury or CDFI funds, like, oh, by the way, we have a continuing resolution that expires on January 30th. Well, I think that right now, the common conventional wisdom is that we are likely not going to have another shutdown. It's still possible. And so if we do have another shutdown, that obviously could delay that process as well. So all of those things, I think, make it really difficult to have the round open anytime soon. And for those that are members of the New Market Tax Credit Working Group, I sent out an email at the beginning of the year sharing a lot of these observations, and that Our prediction right now for the opening of the next round is not anytime soon, and it's likely to be late this summer, keeping in the tradition of using seasons to predict timing that the CDFI Fund likes to use. So I think that, 2026, as Director mentioned on the Community Advisory Board meeting, is going to be a catch-up year for new market tax credits as well, catch-up to allow them to make these changes to align with the administration's priorities and such. And so when you add all that together, it doesn't make it seem reasonable or likely that it would be anytime soon. I think that it would be important if the CDFI Fund can also share that information, because I think that is extremely helpful for all of those involved in new market tax credits. Sitting around trying to read tea leaves is a lot harder to do, and then creates a lot of anxiety. And I think that if they can come out and kind of share what their plan is, I think that would be extremely helpful as well.
Great. Thank you for that, Brad. So late summer of 2026.
Yes, that's right. I'll try to remember to come back and see if that's accurate.
I'm sure there's probably at least one member of our audience that's writing it down, and we'll.
I think it's Rebecca, especially if she has a different guess. That's right.
Let you know if you were wrong. The question is, will you let them know if it was right?
That's right.
I'll give them this win.
So we have already mentioned in the podcast, we'll be at the conference in San Diego next week, as well as you have the working group session on the Wednesday before. For those who aren't already members of the working group and want to, look at it and assess whether or not they want to join, I definitely would encourage anyone in our audience who works with new market tax credits or just more generally to join the working group. Brad's a great resource. And between the monthly meetings and then the emails he sends out and all the rest, particularly in times like now, it's very, very valuable. Beyond those, anything more you want to say about the conference or the working group or more generally?
Yeah, I'll just highlight that I am leading our New Markets 101 Basics workshop. So if you're new to new markets, or just new to a role and want to learn more, I definitely invite you to meet with us. We'll be there on Wednesday, so you can come to the workshop and then you can come to the working group meeting and really start the conference off right.
Yeah, I would highly recommend that as well. Rebecca does a great job with the 101 workshop. I'll also be moderating a panel about the CDFI Fund and changes that could help improve the new market tax credit allocation process and such. So feel free to join us for that. And also we'll be leading the working group meeting on Wednesday, as Mike said.
And I'll be leading a Washington Wire panel to lead off the conference Thursday morning to discuss, what is and isn't happening in Washington, D.C., both legislatively and within the administration and within various regulatory bodies in DC. And then that brings this podcast to a conclusion. Please stay around, Brad and Rebecca. I want to get to our off mic section. But before that, I always like to mention to our audience that if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're enjoying watching it or listening to it, please do subscribe. I encourage you to also tell your business associates about it. It is free. And the fact that we're, getting so many listeners and viewers and our audience is sort of expanding. That's one of the reasons why we do it. So please do subscribe and share. And also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please take a moment to like the podcast and or give us a review. That does help promote the podcast. It helps others find the podcast. And then lastly, if there are ideas you have for future shows, please email cpas@novoco.com for any topics that you think we should be covering in the future. And this is Tax Credit Tuesday. It's really Tax Incentive Tuesday because we also do Opportunity Zones, but it is community development related. So don't go too far afield if you're going to make some suggestions, but I encourage sending suggestions to cpas@novoco.com. And with that, we're going to turn to our off mic section. And this is always a fun part where we get to give a shout out to someone who's working in community development, one of the tax credit or tax incentive communities that we all work. We spend so much time on the project finance side and the accounting, valuation, projections, and the rest that sometimes we don't have an opportunity just to sit back and thank others and call them out for the great work that they're doing and serving others. So with that, I will let Rebecca, you go first with your shout out.
Perfect. Well, I'll first shout out just the 142 winners. That was a pretty great holiday present to get. I think one of the things that I love about working in new markets is just getting to see so many different CDEs and, projects and businesses that are looking for investment, and everyone's so excited. And unfortunately, I know there's more than 142 fantastic CDEs out there. That is certainly true. But one that I would love to highlight is Dakotas America. Dustin Ludens is their managing director, and this CDE is one of the 9 CDEs that committed to investing in native areas and has committed a lot to rural communities. And so I think that certainly those things are aligning with the administration's priorities. And I certainly invite any business that's looking at new markets, you can certainly call Brad or myself or any of my, fellow new markets partners. But there's also a wealth of information on our website and the CDFI Fund's website. So you can look in advance of coming to our conference at all the different awardees, where they serve, what their focuses are, and so that you can really go and make a lot of connections with CDEs as you're looking for allocation.
Right. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah, so mine is still within kind of the award announcement phase and all that he did. I'd like to give a shout out to Christopher Allison, the former New Market Tax Credit Program Manager. He retired from the CDFI Fund in December, and I had the honor and pleasure of working with Christopher as part of the New Market Tax Credit Working Group. We obviously liaison a lot with the CDFI Fund and the New Market Tax Credit Office. Christopher came to the CDFI Fund under Bob Ibanez, obviously friend and colleague of ours. And so I got to know Christopher early in his career, and Christopher always did a good job of holding his cards close to the vest as a good government civil servant should. But I enjoyed the interaction and the responsiveness. I can't imagine another agency within the federal government that was as responsive to our questions from the industry and providing guidance as the New Market Tax Credit Program Office was during his tenure there. So thank you to Christopher for managing the New Market Tax Credit Program for so many years and giving it the stability that it needed to help us achieve permanence in 2025. I think that, their guidance of the program really was part of the ability for the industry to show to Congress the importance of new market tax credits. And part of that is the CDFI Fund and the New Market Tax Credit Program's office ability to steer it in the right direction for so many years. So thanks to Christopher, and we look forward to continuing to work with Christopher as he begins his new journey beyond the CDFI Fund. So thanks again.
Oh, thank you for that, Brad. I echo your shout out for Christopher Allison. It's been great working with him. And like you say, look forward to continue to work with him as he continues his journey past the CDFI Fund. And Rebecca, thanks for the shout out to Dakotas Americas. I certainly look forward to all the great work that they'll be able to do serving Native American communities with their award. And with that, I look forward to being together with both of you in San Diego and over 500 of our closest friends. And to our audience, I'm Michael Novogradac. Thanks for listening.
This weekly podcast has been brought to you by Novogradac and Company, LLP. Archived podcasts are available online at www.novoco.com/podcast or by subscribing to the Tax Credit Tuesday podcast in iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, and Radio Public. You can find related links referenced in this podcast on our website at www.novoco.com/podcast. Novogradac & Company, LLP is a national certified public accounting and consulting firm with offices nationwide. Learn more about our professional services at www.novoco.com.